My name is Kayla, and I graduated from college 5 years ago. I left home and began living independently as soon as I started college. My father, who was rather eccentric, had always hoped for a son. When I was born a girl, he made no effort to hide his disappointment, often expressing his dissatisfaction with my mother. Throughout my childhood, my father never accepted me and rarely showed me affection. My memories of him are marred by his cold demeanor and the harsh words he used to dismiss me. It was my mother who offered me love and protection, taking on both parental roles to shield me from my father's harshness. 6 years later, my sister Emery was born. Though my father was initially disappointed once again at having another girl, his attitude towards Emery soon changed. He began to dote on her, showering her with praise and affection, while I remained largely ignored. As I progressed through elementary, middle, and high school, the contrast between his treatment of Emery and me became stark. Emery was celebrated for even the smallest achievements, while my father's only words for me were tinged with disappointment. Despite my mother's reassurances that Kayla is different from Emery, but she's very cute too, my self-esteem continued to suffer. When college came around, I decided to move out and live on my own. My relationship with my father had deteriorated to the point where I felt it was unbearable to remain under his roof. He grudgingly covered my college admission fee but made it clear that he would not contribute further, saying any available funds would be reserved for Emery. I had to rely on scholarships and part-time jobs to make ends meet. My college years were consumed by balancing studies and work, leaving no room for the typical college experience. My connection with my family dwindled, with only occasional calls from my mother and no communication from my father or Emery. During my job search after graduation, salary was my top priority. I needed to repay a portion of my scholarship and had learned the value of income from my part-time work. Thanks to a recommendation from a senior professor and my determination during interviews, I secured a position with my first-choice global consulting firm. My mother was ecstatic, as if my achievement were her own, but my father and Emery showed no reaction. While I had expected this, it still left me feeling isolated and unfulfilled. I threw myself into my work, channeling my frustrations into my career. This drive allowed me to excel quickly, impressing clients and securing contracts. As my success grew, so did my income, and I began to steadily climb the professional ladder. 5 years into my career, I had established myself as a trusted leader managing multiple projects. During this successful phase, I received an unexpected call from my father, whom I hadn't heard from in years. "Your mother had an accident and is paralyzed on one side. I need you to come home and take care of her. I assume you've been loafing around, so here's your chance to do something useful." I was stunned to learn of my mother's accident and her dire condition. My father, having no idea about my job, had wrongly assumed I was unemployed and idle. Despite my reluctance to return home, my concern for my mother outweighed everything else. I quickly arranged to work remotely from my company, which fortunately supported telework. I decided to keep my apartment lease, even though it felt wasteful to pay for a place I wouldn't be using. Packing only the essentials, I headed back to my family home after nearly 9 years away. When I arrived, I found my mother's condition was worse than I'd imagined. She was paralyzed on one side and unable to walk. Though her mind and speech remained unaffected, her physical suffering was evident, and the sight of her in pain was heartbreaking. I confronted my father about why he hadn't informed me about the accident or the state of home care, but his response was as indifferent as ever. "Telling you wouldn't change anything. I called you now because I had no other choice." I was frustrated by his lack of concern and his failure to keep me informed about my mother's condition. The state of the house was appalling. Clothes were scattered everywhere, dishes were piled high in the sink, and dust and garbage were everywhere. My mother's care had been neglected, and she had developed painful bedsores. I had no expectations from my father, but Emery, who also lived there, should have been helping. When I asked Emery about it, she responded, "I can't do housework, so I can't take care of Mom either. I'm glad you're back." Emery, spoiled and self-centered, had become incapable of contributing to household chores. I began by tackling the mess, which had accumulated over several months. Cleaning the house took nearly a week, partly because I was also attending to my mother's needs. Despite her constant apologies for being a burden, I remained cheerful and energetic, hoping that my care would aid in her recovery. While I handled the housework and caregiving, neither my father nor Emery offered any assistance. Instead of helping, my father constantly complained. The food tastes terrible. What are you doing? You're clumsy at taking care of your mother. You have all the time in the world, so do it right. To him, it was only natural for me to take on these responsibilities. Emery, on the other hand, would demand, Kayla, wash my clothes. I need them for school tomorrow, and bring me some tea. I felt like a servant, especially with my father's unrelenting criticism, who believed I was merely a neat freak, although I was primarily focused on telework, housework, and caregiving. To him, it seemed I was just a reclusive homebody. Even though work required me to go to the office regularly, my father would sometimes greet me at the entrance with accusations. You're just a shut-in, and yet you're out gallivanting. Take care of the house properly. His angry voice echoed through the house, while Emery added, you're really useless, just out playing. Exhausted, I would return to my apartment for brief respites, tidying up my place before heading back. I was grateful for having kept that apartment, as it provided me a sanctuary from the unreasonable demands and harsh treatment that intensified each day. My father, who had berated me for not contributing enough, now demanded money. You must have some savings. Even if you're a neat freak, contribute to the household. Emery's demands were no better. I'm going on a day trip with my friends, so give me some money, she said. Despite doing nothing to help around the house, I felt like I was neither a daughter nor a sister to them. The days became increasingly painful. One time, Emery screamed, my ring is missing. Kayla, do you know where it is? I had no idea where her ring was and didn't care since our tastes differed. When I told her so, she stormed into my room. I was slow to react, but when I arrived, Emery was triumphantly declaring, look, I found the ring. Kayla stole it, didn't she? She emerged from the room with the ring, pointing at me and shouting. I immediately realized this was a setup, an act of harassment for not giving her money. Emery quickly ran to my father, who had just arrived home. Stealing Emery's things? How pathetic. I don't remember raising a daughter who would steal. Despite my explanations, my father wouldn't believe me. Emery added, we don't need a thief. Kayla, if it weren't for your care of our mother, I'd kick you out right now. Have some shame. And so, I was unfairly branded a thief. One evening during dinner, my father suddenly erupted in rage for reasons I couldn't understand. You're useless, can't even manage the house properly, and the food you make is terrible, still not contributing money to the household. Do you think your job is enough? You're just a shut-in who runs around doing nothing. I've had enough. I'm going to destroy your precious toy. With that, he stormed towards my room. My toy was my computer, a crucial tool for my work. If it were destroyed, it would be a disaster. I rushed after him, protecting my computer as he reached to damage it. Emery watched from behind, smirking with satisfaction. As my mind and body neared their breaking point, my mother passed away peacefully. She had always been grateful for my care and distressed by how my father and Emery treated me. The loss drained my strength. My heart was so shattered that I couldn't even cry. My father and Emery, however, showed no tears, acting as though a mere inconvenience had been removed. Our lack of emotion stemmed from entirely different reasons. After a quiet funeral, my father summoned me to the living room. Your mother's gone, and you're no longer needed here. I want you to leave immediately. We don't need a useless NEET who doesn't contribute to the household. I had anticipated something like this, but hearing it out loud was still shocking. I tried to assert my hard work, but my father was resolute. Emery chimed in. Are you planning to stay here as a freeloader? You're like a parasite, a tick or a flea. The harsh words left me dizzy. And about your mother's inheritance, you must renounce it. You're entitled to nothing. I hadn't given the inheritance much thought. The love I received from my mother was more valuable to me than any inheritance from my father or Emery. I don't want it. I'll renounce it and leave. I replied. Fine, leave right away. I requested one day to pack up and immediately began preparing to move out. The following day, my father said, ready to move? Hurry up. I'm leaving and want nothing more to do with this house or you. Goodbye. I loaded my packed belongings into a taxi I had arranged, reflecting on how few possessions I had. After 9 years away, returning to my parents' house and now leaving again felt final. The hollow reality of my father and Emery had been painful, but I was satisfied that I had been able to help my mother. Back in my apartment, I switched from telework to regular work and was grateful I had kept the place. My previous routine resumed, though now I worked even harder, trying to forget everything that had happened. About 3 months later, I received an unexpected call from my estranged father. Reluctantly, I answered the phone. "What's this promissory note? The amount is outrageous. Are you just a freeloader? How much are you earning every month?" My father's questions came rapid fire. I reassured him that I was far from being a freeloader. Thanks to my dedication to my job, my income was substantial, and I had accumulated significant savings. When I first began caring for my mother, I had invested in equipment to improve her environment and contributed to the household expenses to lighten her burden. Even before my father demanded money, I had been financially supporting my mother and even covered Emery's tuition to ease her worries. My mother, appreciative of my financial support, had insisted on formalizing it with a promissory note. This note, reflecting my considerable contributions, had effectively placed a financial obligation on my father and Emery, who had benefited from it, while I had renounced the inheritance. In essence, they were required to repay all the money I had given. After I explained everything, my father was left speechless. In his frustration, he declared he would renounce the inheritance too, but since they had already benefited from it, he had no legal grounds. "Work hard to repay what you owe and don't contact me again. I'm cutting ties with you." Ignoring his rants, I ended the call and blocked him. Soon after, my uncle, my mother's brother, caused further upheaval for my father and Emery. Having met him for the first time in years at my mother's funeral, I had shared my experiences with him. It turned out that the family home was owned by my uncle, and my mother had been renting it. The right to rent had passed to my father and Emery through inheritance, but my uncle refused to renew the lease. Legally, tenants have certain protections, but my uncle's influence prevailed. The family was forced to vacate the property. My father, already on his company's restructuring list, was eventually let go. Emery, unable to pay her tuition, had to drop out just before graduation. With no home or jobs, they ended up in a small apartment, with most of my father's retirement savings going towards repaying the debt to me. Finding new employment at his age seemed unlikely, and Emery's prospects as a college dropout were also dim. They were left struggling in their small, dark apartment. Meanwhile, I focused on my career, acquiring new clients and launching new projects. My hard work paid off, leading to my promotion as the first female division head in the company's history. Although it took time for the company to appoint its first female leader, I am dedicated to nurturing the next generation and making the company more inclusive.